Wild Health is about optimizing you. We use genomics, blood work, biometrics, microbiome assessment, many other tests, and a conversation with you to come up with a full health optimization plan. What's the perfect diet, exercise, and supplement plan for you and only you? The Wild Health podcast is about optimizing all of us. Here we cover the cutting edge science that gives you the base to be able to apply the personalized plan we give you as a patient. To sign up as a patient, go to wildhealth.com. Or if you're a physician or health coach and you want to learn how to do this for your patients, we're happy to help as well. Wildhealth.com for all the information on becoming a patient or working with us.
Hey, Ari, thanks for coming back on and talking all things nutrition.
Absolutely.
I feel like we are dancing around one of the more dangerous pitfalls or rabbit holes when it comes to nutrition on today's pod, because we're going to talk about protein. And I'm just going to take a wild guess that none of your patients ever ask you how much protein they should be eating.
No, never. No, probably daily. Big topic.
Yeah. I mean, we talked the last time about vegan sources of protein and how to get protein and approach meeting protein goals if you were plant-based and relatively restrictive about where your protein sources were coming from. I want today to dive a little bit deeper into working with folks who are open to eating meat, fish, dairy, etc. So before we get into the sources of protein you recommend most frequently and sort of the rationale behind that, let's just talk a little bit about like USDA protein guidelines and whether or not that's sort of how you shape a protein goal for a given patient.
Yeah. So the RDA for protein is set at about 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So for example, if you're like 150 pounds, that would be 54 grams of protein. Now that's for just maintaining, like that's not for optimal health. That's like just like the minimum amount that you need to sustain like a healthy body, I guess. But more and more research is coming out. We're really finding that that's not really sufficient, especially as we age. Starting at age 30, I think we're losing like 3 to 5% of a lean body mass per year. And so by the time we're like 60, 65, if we're not really proactive with it, that could be really detrimental to our overall health and well-being. So typically I recommend closer to 0.8 to 1 gram per ideal body weight, which is obviously a lot higher than the RDA.
All right. So, and thank you. Yes, not USDA, RDA. I'm mixing up my acronyms, but I appreciate you calling me out because I want to get things right. Talk to me about, okay, I'm a patient and I'm coming to you and I'm 40 years old. I'll wind the clock back a little bit for myself. And how do I know what my ideal body weight is?
Yeah. So your ideal body weight. So there's a couple ways. Like you can actually look at charts and see like what an ideal BMI is for your height and weight and your age and sex and those things. But for me, when I talk to somebody, I really talk to them about where do you feel your best in terms of energy in your skin, like how you feel out and about and just moving your body, because I think that's what's really important. So when I look at ideal body weight, I really look at what's a weight where you can sustain and do all the things that you want to do every day and feel really, really good about it.
Awesome. And when you're doing 1 gram per ideal body weight, are you doing pounds ideal body weight or kilos? Because, for me, my ideal body weight's probably about 185, pretty tall. So, and that's just, if I'm under that, I start feeling like things aren't working well for me. But if I'm doing it in kilograms, that would only be like 80 something grams of protein per day. So you're going 1 pound, 0.8 to 1 gram of protein per pound of ideal body weight.
Typically, and everybody, it really depends on their goals. So obviously we'll assess like what they're looking for and if it's longevity versus performance versus just your everyday individual looking to optimize some of their health markers. But typically I put people in the range of 0.8 to 1.
Yeah. And I mean, need almost needless to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. If you're, looking to put on just, you're 21 years old and you're looking to enter a functional bodybuilding competition, or you're a competitive strength athlete, or you're, in the CrossFit games, etc., you may have a higher daily protein goal than what we're talking about. This is sort of, above the range of what the RDA is, because we think that's probably pretty light with regards to retaining lean muscle mass as we age. Certainly enough to support athletic performance, but there may be circumstances, and in fact there are, where that's not even sufficient and we want to be higher than 0.8 to 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. So as with everything, it depends. But I think a broad stroke that doesn't depend is that that sort of, 60 grams of protein or less for a 150 pound person seems pretty scant in terms of ideal performance. Okay, cool. Well, let's jump into sources of protein beyond vegan sources of protein. So if you were, if you had to pick your top 5 sources of protein for anybody, and we'll dive in a little bit as to how like genetics or labs might alter this for a given patient. But if you just had to give a most applicable for most people, what are your top 5 go-tos?
Yeah. So again, like a lot of this depends, like you said, but I tend to kind of go towards like a Mediterranean style approach, which really is a lot of our leaner proteins in our fish. So some of my favorites are going to be really good quality chicken. We might also include things like eggs, but again, quality of eggs really matters. So when I talk about all of these, I'm really making sure that quality is there. And then fish like salmon, mackerel, anchovies, sardines, herring, which are our smash fish, higher in omega-3s, lower in heavy metals, especially mercury. And those are going to be my favorites. Now, I know organ meats are really big right now. There's a lot of benefits there. I don't know about you, Mike. I haven't been able to really get into a groove with incorporating them into my diet, but it is something that I'm interested in. And then I think for some people, looking at the game meats like elk, bison, things like that could also be a good option, of course, depending on labs and genetics.
Yeah, so I'm with you, Ari. I know that there's health benefits to eating organ meats. Specifically, liver has a bunch of health benefits, and it's not my jam. But to be fair, I say it's not my jam, and I said that mackerel was something I wasn't going to try because I wouldn't like it, and I eat mackerel probably 6 days a week now. So this sourcing is something I'm a little bit concerned about. It's not like I can just go to my regular supermarket and pick up high quality grass-fed beef liver. So if you live on a farm in Kentucky, Matt, you might be able to get easy access to this kind of stuff, but it takes a little bit more effort. I think that's probably the biggest barrier for me with regards to branching out into organ meats. All right, well, let's narrow it down a little bit for in terms of specific patient scenarios. So let's say you've got someone who is pretty intolerant to dietary saturated fat. They've got a couple of genetic predispositions where they're more likely to develop dyslipidemia or insulin resistance in response to a diet that's high in saturated fat. And let's say they've come to us, we've done some labs, and in fact, they've got an unhealthy looking lipid profile, or they've got some signs of insulin resistance. Now we're really working on trying to get good sources of dietary protein that are low in dietary saturated fat. And what sorts of, I can say right off the bat, wild caught Pacific salmon, fantastic in this, but Alaskan salmon tends to have more saturated fat in it. And I think of things like ribeye being probably a problem for somebody in that scenario. So other sort of foods to avoid, sources of protein to avoid for those kinds of folks.
Yeah. So anything like when you can see visible marbling, of course, that's going to be a sign that's going to have more saturated fat. So like you mentioned ribeyes, but different cuts of meats, typically red meat is naturally just higher in saturated fat, period. So if someone is trying to really keep it under the 20 grams per day, which is often recommended in those scenarios, I I tend to kind of ask them to give it a trial without a lot of red meats, and then really switching over towards, like you mentioned, specific types of salmon, some of those other smash fish that we talked about before, chicken, and really looking at kind of removing things that are going to be things like pork, any of the red meats, high fat dairy. They could switch to something that's a lower fat dairy, which would be a lot lower. Eggs, I kind of take a risk benefit scenario. So if there's somebody that also like needs a lot of choline, or they just really like having eggs for breakfast, and that's keeping them from having like donuts and other highly processed food in the morning, then I am usually willing to kind of say like, okay, well, how can we kind of still make those fit without it being detrimental to some of your lipid panel? And so they might mix like one egg with some egg whites, or different strategies that we kind of work through together.
Yeah, and I mean, this is one of the areas. I don't know if you do this with patients who you're working with who really need to try out a lower saturated fat diet, but this is one of the areas where I think macro tracking is actually super helpful. Is just to get a sense of, hey, I'm targeting 20 or 25 grams or less of saturated fat. I don't want to have to sit down and barcode scan everything I eat for the rest of my life. But to take a week of what you're eating and just do that for a week, you can get a really good sense of which foods are the biggest sources there for you. And it turns out that, an egg is probably 1.5 grams of saturated fat. So if you're looking to get 20 grams or less in a day and you're getting 3 grams because you have 2 eggs, you could probably continue to tolerate that just fine. Sometimes just seeing that data and working with patients can be really helpful.
Yeah, that's so true. I think it's really just about like the awareness. And, we always hear that eggs are bad and people are surprised. We're like, no, like they can be a part of your healthy diet, even if you have a saturated fat intolerance. And then we also think about like butters. So just switching the type of oils that they're using for cooking, switching from butter to, olive oil, avocado oil. Or I know a lot of people were really into the coconut products for a while. Coconut is one of the only saturated fats that comes from a plant source. And so if they're cooking with off coconut oil or doing like bulletproof coffees or anything, that would be an obvious one that we would want to switch up as well.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Coconut has burned me in the past when I'm trying to figure out where somebody's saturated fat is coming from, and I just can't figure it out. It's usually coconut oil or MCT oil that ends up rearing its head. All right. Labs will play a role in here as well, as we kind of talked about. So I just think it's worth calling out that, there are folks who may have some genetic predisposition towards dyslipidemia or insulin resistance with, a combination of PPAR SNPs and FTO SNPs and some of the other genetic signs that kind of lead us in that direction. But you look at their labs and their lipids are pristine, and their hemoglobin A1C is 4.9. And sorry about the background noise if that's coming through. In those patients, I think we've got a little bit more leeway to work on addressing their dietary saturated fat. It's not just the genetics, it's the entire picture, and it's what they're doing from how they feel, what they're doing from their lab standpoint, as well as what predispositions they may have. All right, talk to me about amino acid profiles, because that's something that comes up quite a bit, and it seems like that's a hot topic. I think we probably touched on this a little bit in the last podcast about vegan sources of protein, but how do you know if you're getting a good balance of amino acids in your protein source, and which sources tend to give you the most balanced amino acid profile?
Yeah. I think if you're eating enough protein in general from animal sources, you're not going to have to worry about the specific amino acids, because you're going to be getting that full amino acid profile from those animal proteins. However, if you are having some more vegetarian proteins, or maybe even like half and half animal and vegetarian proteins, it might be a little bit more important just to take a look at it, especially if you have specific goals around, gaining lean body mass or muscle mass as we age. So I would say that, like, how do you know if you're having consistent protein at every meal? So I usually recommend at least a palm size, which is generally 3 to 4 ounces for most women. Men typically need a little bit more than that, just because they're generally bigger individuals. That can be a good rule of thumb if you're not tracking it. And so usually I recommend breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Make sure that you have a good source of protein, and that you're not going to too many meals without protein at all.
Okay. And I'm going to rapid fire some protein myths or questions that I know you've heard before at some point and probably daily based on how often these questions get funneled towards you. But I remember when I was in high school that if you wanted to gain muscle mass, you needed to make sure that you were getting protein around the clock. And that meant that you should actually like drink a casein shake or something close to bed, or wake up in the middle of the night and have some protein. So obviously that one is a little bit ridiculous, the waking up in the middle of the night to eat some protein. But talk to me a little bit about timing of dietary protein. Does it make a big difference whether you're getting protein sort of at every meal versus making sure that you're getting some sort of protein every few hours? Does it make sense where your protein timing comes in with regards to your training? What sort of advice would you give there around protein timing?
Yeah, that's a big question, and I have several different thoughts. So the first one I'll just start with, I think protein as part of the first meal of the day, regardless of what your first meal is, whether it's first thing in the morning when you wake up, or if you're doing some intermittent fasting and you're starting at say 11 or 12, having protein first is going to be really important. And that's going to help to set the tone for the day. So it's going to keep your blood sugar levels more stable. It's going to help keep your energy levels consistent, so you're not having that crash. Because protein helps to regulate blood sugar. So we're not seeing that roller coaster. And so that's where the energy component comes in. Do I think you have to be eating protein every hour? Like, absolutely not. Usually every 3 to 5 hours, depending on how many meals you're trying to get in. But I think that starting with protein is one of the biggest things that you can do. And especially for my females who are training first thing in the morning, I think that protein, so really for anyone, when we're thinking about protein timing around workouts, having a little bit beforehand can be helpful, but having it afterwards is probably even more impactful. Whether it's part of just your a balanced meal within that couple of hours after your training, or if it's right after. I know a lot of people are doing the protein shakes, which, I mean, whey protein is a great way to get those amino acids to your muscles really quickly. So I think it can play a profound impact on recovery, especially if you're somebody that is trying to see body composition changes, you have strength goals, or you're just trying to show up every day and get a good workout in. I think it's really critical.
Do you have to rush to go drink that protein shake immediately after your last rep? Is that also just ridiculous bro science?
Yeah, I think it is. So yeah, they used to think you have to get it in within a half an hour or less. And now I'm finding that within a couple of hours is recommended, but it's probably not as important as we thought it was. So as long as you're having enough protein on a daily basis, you're going to be fine.
Yeah. And then sort of a tag along question to that is, are we able to, let's say that you had a really motivated, slightly bizarre, extreme patient who wanted to get their 130 grams of dietary protein in at a single meal, and then they just really they were doing, I don't know, strict time restricted feeding, and they wanted just one meal a day. Are they actually absorbing 130 grams of protein at that meal?
So probably not. I think they're having good intentions, right? But I think that from a lot of the research I've looked into, anything over about 30 to 40 probably isn't going to be effective. So there was a couple of studies where they kind of gave people different amounts of protein. And after about the 40 grams, there wasn't any increase in muscle protein synthesis. And again, this probably depends on the size of the individual and probably their sex as well. But I think that good rule of thumb, average of 40 grams is probably about the threshold for most people.
Yeah. So that's, I think that's a key point. I mean, it's, I might push that to, somewhere between 40 and 50 for the average person. But if your protein goals are, 180 grams of protein a day, cause 180 pounds is where you feel your best. You need to eat more than 3 servings of protein, most likely, if you're gonna get results there. And I think for a lot of people trying to hit those, that's where things like like whey protein or amino acids can come in, because it can, not everybody wants to eat 4 meals a day. That's sometimes, just doesn't fit into people's lifestyles. And as we know, if it's not something that can fold in, it's not going to be sustainable, and it's just going to fall off as a habit. So probably a good segue to the last thing I had on my list I wanted to pick your brain about, which is essential amino acids versus branched chain amino acids. And can you just supplement essential amino acids as a protein source if, say, you're looking for something to drink while you're training, or you're looking for an alternative to having to sit down and eat another meal?
Yeah, so essential amino acids can be a great way to get them in, especially like you said, people aren't able to eat, 4 times a day, or they are like really busy running around. Like it could be kind of a good supplement option. And essential amino acids basically are the ones we have to get from our diet. Our body can't produce those itself. So using those as, I think the equivalent is around like 20 to 25 grams of protein if you're kind of tracking it to see if you get enough. I think that can be really great. And I think that most people have heard of branched chain amino acid powders. They're not as familiar with the essential amino acid powders. And there's a lot of reasons why we might steer people away from the branched chain amino acids and maybe guide them towards an essential amino acid instead. And I think it's going to be a lot more effective. There's not a ton of really solid research on the effectiveness of branched chain amino acids in general. And you're getting the branched chain amino acids within your essential amino acid supplement.
Yeah. And, there are some genetic predispositions that might make people respond more poorly towards BCAA supplementation. So that's something to keep in mind as well. But it sounds like essential amino acids could be a sort of a protein shake substitute for folks who don't want to be either don't tolerate whey, or just don't like protein shakes, or are looking to supplement their dietary protein intake in some way outside of having yet another piece of chicken or another piece of salmon over the course of the day.
I also found it's really helpful for people who work out first thing in the morning and they can't always get something in, and it sits really well. It's not heavy in your stomach. And so just having a little bit of something before you go, like an essential amino acid powder, can actually kind of be helpful for that too.
That's a great tip, because I feel like meeting, if you're looking for 30 to 40 grams of protein at breakfast, you're not getting that with 2 eggs. And let's say you've got issues with your, saturated fat goals. There's not a whole lot of traditional breakfast meats that fold in very easily into high protein, low saturated fat. I mean, certainly bacon, sausage, that kind of stuff is very high in saturated fat and lower in protein. You could probably do something like ground turkey, and have a low saturated fat, high protein option. But are you making ground turkey every day for breakfast? I don't know. Seems a little bit difficult. So I love that as a practical way for folks to be able to fold protein into that first meal of the day, if in fact it's breakfast time and you're not dealing with somebody who's not eating until later in the day.
Yeah.
Any last thoughts? Either some of the funnier questions you've been asked about protein in the past, or tips and tricks that you don't think we touched on today?
I'm trying to think in terms of like funny things. There's so many like you called it bro science things out there that I've heard. So I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there with like the casing before bed. And I do get that question quite a bit. And do I think that it's really necessary? Because people are like, well, I'm going to break down, muscles while I'm sleeping. I think if you're getting enough throughout the day, it's probably not the biggest issue. I do think that collagen is something that I get asked about quite a bit. And if collagen is a complete protein, and, the answer is no. I think that every collagen supplement has a different composition of amino acids. But primarily, I do like collagen as a supplement. It's primarily glycine, proline, and hydroxyproline. So for joints, ligaments, gut health, I think that can be really important. But I generally don't recommend people adding that into their total grams of protein per day. I don't know how you feel about that, Mike.
Yeah, agreed. I don't, there are many patients I work with who are doing, regimens that include collagen supplementation for all the reasons you mentioned, but probably not worth counting it as a gram of protein if they're actually counting their protein macros. So I'm in agreement there. I just trying to think if there's any other sort of protein-based things that usually come up for me. Whey protein. Let's talk about whey protein just for a minute. If you're somebody who's tried whey protein and you're limited by abdominal discomfort or bloating, which tends to be the big thing that keeps people from coming back to whey protein again. Success that you've seen with either switching people to whey protein isolate or actually using like a lactose, like a lactate or some sort of digestive aid with it?
Yeah, I would say most high quality whey proteins are pretty low in lactose naturally. There are ones that they actually tout as lactose free. And I think those are always a really great option. And I actually find when I'm talking to people, they don't really understand that being lactose intolerant and being intolerant to the proteins in milk might be a different issue. And so we talk about casein and whey, which are the two primary components or protein components of protein. And so when we think about that, like some people tolerate casein okay, some people tolerate whey. I find whey is a lot easier for most people. But as we kind of shift them, I might recommend even doing something like trialing a plant-based protein, maybe with some essential amino acids. We could also just look at like easy ways of getting more lean proteins in their diet if they just want to shift away from using a powder altogether. But I do think for most people, whey protein, in my experience, as long as it's a good quality one, it doesn't have a ton of sucralose and a lot of other additives, I think it's pretty well tolerated.
Yeah. I mean, I think the folks that I've seen have issues with it are folks who have a dairy intolerance. And it's a great call out, right? I think that most people think of being dairy intolerant as being lactose intolerant. And we've worked with people together who have this issue where they're actually intolerant to whey, or they're intolerant to the proteins in milk as opposed to the sugars, which would be the lactose in milk. So those two things can be challenging to separate out at times. But I would rather steer somebody towards, a plant-based protein powder with a good amino acid profile. And that takes actually reading the label because there's a lot of variability there, or working more lean proteins into their diet so that they don't need to be supplementing with a shake. So I think both of those are great strategies.
I think grass-fed whey protein is the way to go. So if you can find one that has, obviously third-party testing is more of a grass-fed whey protein, that's going to be a little bit better for you as well.
Yeah. And I don't think we mentioned it, but grass-fed lean meats, we talked about sourcing, but also tend to be lower in saturated fat. Certainly, there are some other benefits to some of the game meats. So things like venison are actually like a land-based animal that's really high in omega-3s. So there's lots of nuance here and lots of ways that you can work to find a protein source that really is probably ideal for you based on your own genetics, your labs, your goals, body composition, size, gender, age, all of those things. Don't want to oversimplify it, but I think you gave us a lot of really good pointers and take home points today. So appreciate you as always. And we'll find another topic to come back and chat about, and I'll try and bring as many silly bro science questions with me for next time.
I wish I could think of more. I know I have more bro science questions, so I'll keep those in the back of my head.
As you remember them, we can lead off the next podcast with them.
Yeah. And I guess the only other thing I guess I would just add as a caveat is like, I do want to be sensitive to like cultural preferences around proteins and like socioeconomic factors that might affect like access to really good quality protein. So I think like obviously quality is best, but like getting protein in is probably in a sense more important than worrying about like having to have everything grass fed or having to have everything like perfect in accordance to those standards.
I think that's an outstanding call out. It's one thing if you can go out and hunt your own meat and you're in that sort of situation, and it's another if you're able to or willing to pay the premium for some of the sourcing benefits that we're talking about. So thanks for bringing that up. I appreciate that.
Sure.
Awesome. Well, thanks again. Great to see you, and
you too.
We'll chat soon. All right.
Sounds good. Thanks.
You got it.
Thanks for listening to the Wild Health Podcast. If you found it helpful, give us a 5-star rating, and write a review on iTunes. It really helps the podcast, and we greatly appreciate it. If you want to be a client or you want to work with us, go to wildhealth.com. Thanks again.